Hello everyone, I'm Chris Kelly with the Paul Vallas for Mayor Campaign. I'm joined by Paul Vallas for another policy talk. We want to go over some of your questions that have been submitted online by email, over Twitter, and everything else related to Paul's pension plan. Now Paul, you released a Resolving the Pension Plan, Resolving the Pension Crisis last Friday. We got some good write-ins, good traction for it. I got a few questions to kind of go over just to see what people are asking. Very brief, what's your pension plan? What are we trying to do if we're looking at the overarching thing? What's the goal here?
Well, look, my goal is to solve the pension funding problem once and for all. As I mentioned in my presentation, we have to put another $1 billion into the pension system by 2023. It's a ramp up, and I've laid out a plan that allows us to ramp up on the revenue side, so that, or for that matter, what I would call the city savings side, so that we have enough money to address our pension issues, structurally balance our budget, and permanently cap property taxes and fees and fines. So, in a nutshell, my plan is to address our pension funding obligations without requiring additional contributions and without requiring a reduction in benefits, period. We need to keep our promises. In order to reduce benefits, you have to have a constitutional amendment. It's not going to happen even before our new Governor Pritzker basically said thumbs down that he wouldn't support a change in the Constitution. So, I'm moving to address the pension funding issue without increasing contributions, without changing benefits, and I believe I can do that. I believe I can do that with a reasonable agenda. I call it the fair share agenda, to make sure that the city receives the resources that we're entitled to through the local government distributed fund, through ending the corporate personal property replacement tax diversion, and all things that we're entitled to, all things that we should be getting, and through continue to make progress towards full funding equity when it comes to how the state funds teacher retirement, because we've been getting shortchanged over the years. We made some progress on addressing that issue, but more needs to be made. I'm also not counting, while I support the legalization of casino gambling and the taxing of cannabis, and for that matter, the legalization of gaming, video poker, and things like sports betting. I'm not counting on that revenue, so that's almost a contingency. So my plan will actually potentially generate more money than I'm counting on in this budget, but I don't want to count on revenues that are unproven. So I think it's a solid legislative plan, and my plan also assumes that we're going to be able to I'm going to be able to secure some reasonable reductions in city expenditures of at a minimum 5%, but not in a single year, but actually over a 4-year period, because again, it's a ramp up. And look, I've done this before. I took a $1.4 billion budget in the Chicago Public Schools in 1995. It was a $1.4 billion structural deficit, 5-year structural deficit. And 6 years later, I left the district with 6 balanced budgets and $400 million in cash reserves and almost $1 billion in cash balances. And incidentally, 78 new school buildings, 350 renovated buildings, and a fully funded pension system. And during that same period, I raised teacher salaries 17% without closing a single school. So I know how to balance budgets, and I know how to reprioritize budgets. So realizing 5% savings plus is easy to do. And I've identified certain areas that I would look at where I think there's significant savings to be had, like workman's comp, like negotiating better contracts with healthcare providers. I want to restore retiree healthcare, but I think we can get better contracts with our healthcare providers. Like getting a hand on overtime. I mean, in the police department alone, we've been paying about about anywhere ranging in any year from $50 to $125 million a year more in overtime than we paid when I was city budget director, and I had a record number of police officers on the street. So, so there's more money to be, I think, secured through more effective enterprise fund reimbursements. I think our collections can be better. I believe many departments and many agencies and programs can be monetized, and I think there's efficiencies to be secured through consolidations and reorganization. But I've laid out about a dozen areas with benchmarks where I believe savings can be secured. And again, we're not talking about, we're talking about 5-6% savings in base expenditures over a 5-year period, not in a single year. So I think it's this is very achievable because I've done it before. Mm-hmm. I've done it before, and I think if we're able to achieve our state agenda, that again doesn't count on unproven revenue sources like casino gambling and gaming and cannabis. And if we're able to achieve our reasonable and to a certain extent modest reductions in our city expenditures, and I'm not even counting on the potential money that could be saved through the enactment of a pension obligation bond. I think this would enable us to fully fund our pensions and set the stage where we could begin to reprioritize our budget, so we could begin making those critical investments in the community, investments in public safety infrastructure, investments in affordable housing, investments in economic development initiatives, the type of investments that will help our communities grow and prosper. It would also enable us to, in effect, implement a financial plan that would allow us to permanently cap our property taxes. And I want our property taxes never to grow by more than 5% or the rate of inflation, whichever is less. And historically, that would have meant over the last 5 to 6 years is no one would have ever seen their property taxes grow by more than 1 or 2% a year, even in years that their property was reassessed and they saw a 20, 30, 40% increase in their assessed valuation. Even those properties in rapidly gentrifying areas, they would have not felt the impact on their property tax bill. So I want to permanently cap property taxes, and I want to really freeze fees, and I want to limit fines so that no one ever pays a fine that exceeds the cost of a fee, or for that matter, a ticket. And my plan also assumes the elimination of the red light cameras.
Let's talk pension obligation bonds for a moment. We got a lot of questions on that. I'm up for it. You've come out against pension obligation bonds. Mayor Emanuel said $10 billion pension obligation bonds in the summer. We said no, too risky. What's changed now? What's the idea? What's the difference now? And then we'll do some follow-ups.
Well, I'm looking at pension obligation bonds as a backup and as a contingency. All right. So, again, in my financial plan, my comprehensive financial plan, I've laid out a number of contingencies so that if something happens on the one side slower than anticipated, or doesn't happen, I'll have backup, I'll have alternatives. This plan could potentially put the city in much better financial condition than even I'm projecting, because, I always make conservative assumptions. I always like to underestimate my revenues and overestimate my expenditures. So that I can err on the side of being cautious. So, my problem with the mayor's original pension obligation bond proposal was that two things. One is pension obligation bonds are always going to be risky because for the layman out there, what he wanted to do was they wanted to issue $10 billion in bonds, invest those bonds in the pension systems, hope for a rate of return of about 7.5%, which maybe you've been getting that rate of return the last 3 or 4 years, but it certainly hasn't been the historical, investment returns over the last 10, 12, 15 years. But the idea was they would borrow, issue a bond, put $10 billion in the pension funds, get a return of 7.5%, and then they would pay off the bonds at an interest rate of 5.5%. So it would be a net winner, and by significantly increasing the contributions by $10 billion, you would be able to reduce your annual payment, the annual increases in payments, because remember they have to put about $1 billion more into the pension system from now until 2023, almost a doubling, and that would reduce the amount of increases every year. So that is what they want to do with theory. My problem with that is it's very risky, because what if you don't get a return that's greater than what you're paying? That's always a risk. But my even bigger problem was the fact that in order to pay off those bonds, the city would have to dedicate its remaining flexible revenue. Now, for the layman out there, 93% of all property, after you take out the almost, I think next year it'll be close to $700 million that is being diverted from property tax revenues to fund tax increment financing districts. After you take that out, 93% of the remaining revenue already goes to fund pensions. All right, the balance goes to the libraries, and another major source of city revenues is sales taxes. Well, the increased revenues from sales taxes has been securitized. It is used to guarantee the bonds that the city issues. The city needed to issue bonds at reasonable interest rates. They wanted to get good bond ratings on their bonds. So what they had to do is they had to create this structure so that the bonds could absolutely be guaranteed. So the bulk of the city's revenue is already locked up. It's already been securitized. It's almost as if the revenue has been privatized, to put it in layman's terms. So what would we use to fund the pension obligation bonds? Well, what? Our share of the state income tax, our share of our personal property replacement tax. We would have to securitize or dedicate our remaining flexible revenue. And that can create a very dangerous situation, because what if we hit a severe recession and economic downturn? Our revenues dipped. The bondholders, they own our revenue. So we would have to do one of two things, and they're both bad. We would have to go in and make draconian cuts in basic services. What are we going to do? Not fill police vacancies? Well, we've been doing that, and look at the damage that is caused. Or not, close all of our mental health centers. I mean, just think of the disaster that would befall the budget. If we hit a recession and all our revenues locked up, because the bonds are going to get paid off no matter what. The second bad thing that could happen would be we wouldn't cut, but rather we'd be forced to dramatically increase our home rule taxes, meaning property taxes, to in effect cover the loss in revenue. So property taxes would skyrocket. So for those two reasons, I had problems. I had real problems with the pension obligation bond and the risks that it would pose to the city and to the city's taxpayers. So
enter the inspiration of TIF.
Right, the inspiration or perspiration of TIF. So what I said is, if I were to consider a pension obligation bond, what I would do is I would use future TIF revenue that is going to be freed up once the TIFs expire. So as the TIFs expire, there will be revenue windfalls that will be freed up. And what I would do is, if I were to issue pension obligation bonds, or saw market conditions favorable to the issuance of such bonds, I would dedicate available revenues that would be available from retiring TIFs to finance the bonds. That would be a way of taking advantage of the TIF windfalls now when you need them. You see, so
but how does that compare to how we're using TIFs now?
In terms of
how we use the different revenues, or how we use the different funds?
Well, right now, as TIFs expire, they're supposed to go back to the revenues would then go back to the local governments, county, schools, the city. What the city's been doing in extending a lot of the TIFs is like hanging on to those revenues, although in recent years, they've been giving a lot of the TIF surplus money to schools, etc. Remember, the city is picking up the employee share of the Chicago Teachers Retirement System. I think it's close to like $500 million. So the city raised property taxes to basically support the Chicago Teachers Retirement System. And so, taking a share of future TIF revenues, I'm not saying all of it, maybe half of it, that the revenues would be freed up, and using it to fund a pension, to finance a pension obligation bond would be an option. You wouldn't be taking all the revenue, you would only be taking perhaps part of the revenue. You could make a determination as to how much you would need, but it would allow you to put billions of dollars into the pension systems now, improve the unfunded liability, and obviously that would reduce, that would slow the ramp up, or the contributions that you would need to make in the ramp up. Mm-hmm. It would extend the ramp up for a few more years. So that's certainly an option, but I'm not relying on, my financial plan does not rely on that option, but my financial plan presents a number of contingencies, and that would be the only way, and I believe the best way, to do pension obligation bonds. I mean, that would make sense, because you wouldn't be securitizing your remaining revenues. You wouldn't be handcuffing yourself by taking away your remaining current flexible revenues, and you wouldn't be putting city services at risk or creating conditions for a possible big increase in property taxes if if interest rates plummeted and you weren't getting the return on your investments that you anticipated.
So a few quick ones as we go through it.
Yes.
From Facebook, another, what's the legal reality concerning the courts who've historically ruled in favor of already agreed upon pensions in light of the political reality coming to agreement amenable to all interested parties, including taxpayers? How realistic is this?
Well, look, I don't think there's going to be a grand compromise, even if the governor supported it. I just don't think it's going to happen. I don't think you're going to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot to reduce pension benefits, period. And I think it's going to be hard to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot for a progressive income tax. Let me point out that you don't have to change the Constitution to get a progressive income tax. You can get a progressive income tax by raising the income tax and using a portion of the new revenues to finance targeted tax credits and tax exemptions and tax breaks. So you can take a large number of taxpayers, particularly middle to lower income taxpayers, out of the tax increase through targeted credits. See, the Constitution requires uniformity. So you can't have a progressive income tax, but you have to have a uniform tax. So, if you raise property taxes, if you raise income taxes, by 1% or 1.5% in terms of the rate going up 1%, 1.5%, not the percentage collection going up that much. I mean, you could use a part of that money and provide a doubling or a tripling of their residential property tax credit, homeowners property tax credit, or for that matter, you can provide a renter's credit. You can provide a senior citizen credit. So you can use targeted credits to make the tax more progressive. So I think that may be the route that they go.
Got it. And that's a whole lot of questions. I think you actually.
But the important point to make is your pension benefits are protected.
Right.
They're protected by the Constitution. I don't anticipate a constitutional change. I'm not assuming a constitutional change. My plan will fund pensions without changing benefits, and my plan will fund pensions without requiring an increase in contributions. And let me point out, though, that, we're seeing an increase in contribution from Tier 2 employees, because when the legislature couldn't get the courts to support these pension compromises that change benefits, reduce benefits, they decided to go after new employees, because remember the Constitution says current employees. Once you're in the system, your pension promises have to be kept. So they decided to increase contributions, reduce benefits for new employees. They're called Tier 2 employees. Mm-hmm. Eventually, the majority of employees, in the pension systems, both at the state and local level, city level, will be Tier 2 employees, and they'll probably, over the life of their work and their retirement, pay more in pensions than they'll ever get back. You see, so eventually the systems will right themselves. It's just that there's this transition period where you've got to ramp up the contributions. So you've got to make up for the years that you didn't make contributions.
Got it. So a lot of questions I think we actually addressed inadvertently,
okay.
So I'll go in and I'll address them specifically. So if you did comment something, I'll go through things like benefits, like taxes, like pensions. I think Paul addressed in the opening, so we'll make sure you get those answers directly. As
we get the questions, I'll be available to answer them.
Yeah, so definitely keep sending them in if you see them. We have a whole number of plans on our website at ballasforallchicago.com. We hope to discuss at least the 10-pole ones. We're talking economic development, education, public safety, pensions, and affordable housing, transit and transportation over the next 4 weeks. So just send your questions to me. I'm Chris Kelly. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. You can email me at chris@ballasforallchicago.com. It's Paul Vallas. I got one more question to kind of end out on. So someone asked on Capital Facts, the headline was, Paul Vallas' pension solving sounds reasonable. Well, where's the fun in that if we solve the pension crisis?
Well, first of all, it's fun solving the problems, because it really puts us in a position. Well, there will be nothing more delightful for me than keeping promises that were made to our workers. And solving this problem without requiring that the property taxpayers, hardworking Chicagoans, bear the brunt. And I believe it can be done. I think I've articulated a way to do it. I know how to do this. I've done things like this in the past in terms of taking over large government institutions on the brink of financial collapse and transforming them, not only financially, but also transforming them in the quality of the programs and services that they provided. There were 70,000 more students in the Chicago Public Schools when I left than there are today. And enrollment grew by by close to almost 10% during my 6-year tenure. The only time enrollment has grown in the last 4 decades. That only happens if good things are happening. So there's nothing more pleasurable than solving problems and putting the city in the position to where it can begin to prepare and implement budgets that make the type of investments in the communities that are needed to allow those communities to prosper and grow. I'm talking about restoring beat integrity so that we're not moving cops all over the city. I'm talking about taking advantage of existing, in some cases massive, economic development incentives that are available at the federal level, like opportunity zones, or even at the city level, in terms of things like I refer to as a fair share of TIF revenues, taking a portion of the TIF revenues that are generated from existing TIFs and investing that money in economically hard-pressed areas, or for that matter, taking the city's $20 billion budgets, because the city controls $20 million in revenue budgets. That means schools, that means the airport, that means the enterprise funds, that means the CHA, that means the CTA, just not the city budget, and allocating, making budget decisions that promote Chicago businesses. You buy Chicago, you sell Chicago, you hire Chicago, using that budget in a way that allows for resources to be distributed throughout the city. I mean, that's the joy. That is the potential outcome of this financial plan that I've laid out today. So I enjoy solving problems, but I particularly enjoy the things that you can do once those critical financial issues have been resolved. And at the end of the day, the budget drives everything. I mean, the budget defines who you are. The priorities you set tell people a lot. It says a lot about your values, your character, your commitment. So I've enjoyed trying to work through these problems during the course of the campaign. And I am supremely confident that what I've articulated and the promises that I make will be the promises that I'll be able to keep.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Paul.
Thanks
you
for
very
having
much
me.
for
Thank
watching.
you.
VallasMoraleChicago.com. You can sign up to volunteer, donate, read more, go to our issues page to read through all those. We're always around. Reach out to us on social media. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks.